Hi class, I've been slow to record these last three videos for 1302 just simply because there's so much information. It's pretty daunting bit of information. It's also the more recent history, and there's a lot of folks still around that experienced this history. So with that being the case, it's been a kind of a slow in coming. With that said, let's get into chapter 28 of the American Yawp textbook. Now, as always, I try to keep these videos under 15 minutes. So let's dive back in and get started. Now, the 1960s is going to shape America in a lot of ways. We're going to have to see a lot of cultural, political, social changes. And of course, during this period of time, we see the beginning and the escalation, not the end, of the Vietnam War. Now, the 1960s begins with John Kennedy. And so this is what we call the new frontier in American history. That's what Kennedy promised, a new frontier for the American people. He's elected in 1960, becomes president in early 1961. His administration is going to focus on space exploration, civil rights, and global challenges. But in 1963, of course, he's going to be shot and assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas, Texas. Now, Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson, is going to launch the Great Society program. And these include Medicare, Medicaid, and the war on poverty. He's going to aim to improve Americans' lives. He also is going to pass a number of civil rights bills, like the Voting Act, and there's like a fair housing bill that he passes, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so we see a lot of domestic as well as foreign issues, because again, the Vietnam War is sort of in the background of this whole thing. Now, the 1960s is going to mark a turning point for civil rights, and so some of the key figures, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, are going to galvanize efforts to end segregation and systemic racism in the United States. And so milestones like what I've already mentioned, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which ends discrimination in like public places. Voting Rights Act of 1965, which sort of has the Justice Department get in there and make sure that voting rights are honored. Those are going to be some big victories, but the struggles will, of course, continue. Go back to the 1950s, we've seen boycotts. The 1960s becomes a culmination of that. Now, we're also going to see the Stonewall riots. That's going to be some LGBTQ activism that's going to start off, and the beginning of the gay rights movement. So we have that all happening at the same time. So just as a broad stroke, this is what the 1960s looks like. Now, we're also going to see the rise of the counterculture. This is sometimes referred to as the hippies. If you've seen the movie Forrest Gump, Jenny would be right in the middle of all that. The counterculture is going to challenge traditional norms. Young Americans are going to reject conformity, embracing alternative lifestyles, music, and art, and movements against consumerism and in favor of environmental protection are going to gain momentum as well throughout the 1960s. And at the same time, drug use and anti-war protest are going to become the defining aspects of the youth rebellion, and centered in that, to get the message out, a lot of awesome music comes out of the 1960s as well. Again, watch Forrest Gump, you'll hear some of them. Now, what about the Vietnam War itself? Vietnam begins, and we could actually argue that it really kind of gets its start during the Truman years. The late 1940s, there's some protests within Vietnam to cast out. Of course, the Japanese had been in charge of Vietnam during the Second World War. Well, after that, the French gained control of what had been traditionally, for several hundred years, their French Indochina colony. Well, by the 1940s and the 1950s, Vietnam doesn't really want to be under the French anymore, and that's where this begins. And the United States finds itself in a bad spot. We're allied to the French, but we also are standing for individual self-determination. And so, again, who are we going to side with? Well, at the end, we side with the French. This is getting to be more of a problem under Eisenhower, and it continues to be an issue under Kennedy. And of course, maybe it could be argued that some of Kennedy's reforms aren't necessarily going to happen as well as they might, had it not been for a distracted bit of focus on what's happening over there. But it's under Johnson that we really see the escalation with the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where the reports are we were fired on by an enemy torpedo. It doesn't make contact, and so the report is we've been fired on. Whether we were or not, it's hard to say. But the report goes through the pipe that we have been fired on. And Johnson asks for permission to escalate the war. And they do that through the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. So what is the goal of the Vietnam War really going to be? To stop the spread of communism. Part of that issue of containment that we've talked about in previous chapters. Now, South Vietnam is sort of a democracy. It's not really, we can't really compare it directly to the United States, but it's more of a democracy than North Vietnam is becoming, which is communist and supported by China and the Soviet Union to a point. Key events of this war, for example, in 1968, you've got the Tet Offensive, which this is going to be a major offensive by the South Vietnamese Viet Cong, these South Vietnamese communist rebels. They hit every major city in South Vietnam. Now, they're going to be destroyed as a fighting force, but up until now, we have been told, we the American people have been told, we're winning the war, but this doesn't look like winning. Now, it destroys the Viet Cong, but how did they manage this? And Americans begin to question, how much are we being told and how much are we being told that's truth? So this credibility gap is something that begins to work its way in. Also, in 1968, it takes a few years to discover it, but we start to see some abuses by certain American soldiers over there, like at My Lai, or M-Y-L-A-I. I've heard it pronounced My Lai, I've heard it My Lao, whichever way, it's an incident that happens in 68 or so, but by the time we discover it in the early 1970s, American opinion is really going to start to turn against the war. And it's going to affect even soldiers coming back that had nothing to do with it. They're going to be viewed negatively by many, and it's going to be a tragic, tragic situation in the history of the United States and all of that. Now, Vietnam is going to symbolize the limit of American power and the cost of human intervention, or human costs of intervention, because by the end of the day, we're going to see roughly the same number of casualties dead as we saw at the Battle of Gettysburg many years before. So that's a significant number. And it also lasts a long time. The war lasts about 15 years. Now, in 1968, this is going to be a breaking point in America. Of course, the Vietnam War is raging. We got Tet in January of that year. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy are going to shock the nation, both of which are killed in 68. Robert Kennedy is killed right in the middle of the 1968 presidential election. He's running for the presidency on sort of a civil rights ticket, but he's killed at one of his speaking events. When the Democratic National Convention in Chicago of that year breaks out, deep divisions are going to show themselves. Protests in the street, it becomes nasty. Now, amid all of this turmoil, Richard Nixon is going to win the presidency as a Republican candidate. He had been the vice president under Eisenhower back in the 1950s and had originally run against John F. Kennedy, JFK, in 1960. In fact, Kennedy and Nixon are going to be in the first televised presidential debate, and it's going to sort of set the stage for future presidential debates as well. Well, Nixon he ran 8 years before it, now he's going to win it, and he promises to restore law and order, and his election is going to mark a shift in the conservative direction, but the 1960s are going to continue to sort of shadow what goes on through the early days of Nixon, particularly dealing with the Vietnam War. So the 1960s is a transformational period from civil rights to counterculture, the Great Society, Vietnam. This era is going to define what it means to be an American. So again, this is a brief overview. There's so much information here, there's no way that I can cover it all. So all I can do is sort of paint with broad brushes. So hopefully this has been helpful. Keep that in mind as we go through the remaining videos that I'm recording for you. And hit like if it's been helpful. Let me know if you need anything, and good luck on your exams that are probably right around the corner. Take care.